All right, if we start finding our seats, we'll get going again. Suzanne, are you guys ready? Okay. We'll call the meeting back to order with agenda item number 8, Commission Policy 9, Americans with Disabilities Act, second reading, Commissioner and Administrative Procedures, Regulations and Policy Committee Chairman David McNinch for possible action. The Commission will conduct a second reading of Commission Policy 9, Americans with Disabilities Act, and may take action to officially repeal the policy. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is, we've got on the agenda today, three policies that we're bringing forward for our second reading. And these are all policies that we discussed in a committee meeting back in July. And we did hear these at our commission meeting in Minden in August. And I think that largely this one had to do with the ADA, and the committee did recommend to repeal the policy. The federal law is a very strong law. Everybody's compelled to comply with it, and it's difficult. It's a pretty fluid law at times, and it's hard to keep a policy up to date. And it's just not necessary to have a policy on it. The department has to adapt the way they do business all the time, and there's notices and things. So the committee did recommend repeal of the policy.
Questions from the Commission on Commission Policy number 9? Seeing none, this is an action item. I'll take it out for public comment on agenda item number 8, Commission Policy number 9. Seeing no public comment, I'll bring it back to the Commission. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll make a motion that we repeal Commission Policy number 9, Americans with Disabilities Act, as proposed by the committee.
Second.
I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch with a second by Commissioner Valentine to repeal Commission Policy number 9 as recommended by the Policy Committee. Questions on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously, 7-0, with Commissioner Young still absent, and Commissioner East is not here for the meeting. We'll close agenda item number 8, move to agenda item number 9. Excuse me. Commission Policy 29, arbitration process for applicants dissatisfied with elk incentive tag awards, second reading. Commissioner and APRP, excuse me, Committee Chairman David McNinch and Game Administrator Brian Wakeling for possible action. The Commission will conduct a second reading of Commission Policy 29, arbitration process for applicants dissatisfied with elk incentive tag awards, and may take action to officially implement the policy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so this is a Commission Policy number 9, arbitration process for applicants dissatisfied with elk incentive tag awards. There were amendments made to Nevada Administrative Code, and this policy was brought forward again to the committee in July. forwarded for the first reading in August. From the August meeting, the commission did suggest some minor edits. Those edits have been incorporated, and we have that in front of us today. So basically, the edit was changing the term "as inequitable" to "the department made in error" in a couple of the as clarifying language in the policy.
Questions on Commission Policy 29 from the commission? Seeing none, I'll take it out for public comment on Commission Policy number 29. Seeing no public comment, I'll bring it back to the commission for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd make a motion to adopt Commission Policy 29, arbitration process for applicants dissatisfied with elk incentive tag awards as presented.
Second.
I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch with a second by Vice Chairman Johnston on Commission Policy 29 to approve as presented. Questions on the motion from the commission? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously, 7-0. We'll close agenda item number 9, move to agenda item number 10, Commission Policy 63, Protecting Wildlife from Toxic Ponds, second reading. Commissioner and APRP Committee Chairman David McNinch, and for possible action, the Commission will conduct a second reading of Commission Policy 63, Protecting Wildlife from Toxic Ponds, and may take action to officially revise the policy. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Same scenario, some updates to Nevada Administrative Code regarding industrial artificial pond permits. And those revisions to the policy were brought forward at the first reading in August, and the commission did move those to a second reading without further edits. So,
Questions from the commission on Commission Policy 63? Seeing none, I'll take it out for public comment on Commission Policy 63. With no public comment, I'll bring it back to the commission for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to approve Commission Policy 63 as presented.
second.
I have a motion by Vice Chairman Johnston and a second by Commissioner McNinch to approve the changes to Commission Policy 63 as presented. Questions from the commission? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously, 7-0. Closing agenda item number 10, moving to agenda item 11, Commission Policy 27, Protection of Nevada Wildlife Resources, first reading. Commissioner and APRP Committee Chairman David McNinch and Game Division Administrator Brian Wakeling for possible action. The commission will conduct a first reading of Commission Policy 27 and may take action to repeal or revise the policy. The commission may advance the policy to a second reading for possible adoption at a future meeting. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll ask Administrator Wakeling to come up and help walk through it, but basically, I won't steal too much of his thunder. The policy was specific to had been made specific to gray wolves, and the department's proposal to broaden the scope of the policy and be a little less focused on any one wildlife species was brought forth to the committee, and we had good discussion on it. And what it boiled down to was that the committee was largely supportive of the proposed amendments, with the exception of one small area in one of the sections proposed for deletion, and that had to do with I'll read it real quick. I don't have my glasses. It is the policy of the Commission and the Department of Wildlife to oppose a permanent population of wolves in Nevada, and that was originally slated for deletion. When we had our conversation as a committee, it was an area of concern for some of the committee members, but we didn't want to walk away from a very large portion of the generalization of the policy. So the committee took action to basically support the rest of the policy, the rest of the suggested changes to the policy, with the exception of that one sentence that we left in, to bring it back to the commission as a whole and have a conversation regarding that aspect of it here and what we do with it from this point forward. So Brian, I'll shut up and let you do your thing here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner McNinch. Brian Wakeling, Game Division Administrator, Nevada Department of Wildlife. As Commissioner McNinch mentioned, the department took a review of this policy and took a look at the way it was crafted. Essentially, the policy really addresses a very important aspect, and that's trying to maintain state authority for the management of wildlife species within Nevada. And so the whole focus of the overall rewrite was basically to define those situations under which the state has public trust responsibilities, define those situations under which the federal agencies have the federal trust responsibilities, and then affirm that, that the Commission's position was, to the extent possible, through collaboration and cooperative work, try and maintain the state trust responsibilities to the extent practicable. And so that's the intent of the overall effort in the rewrite, and I'd certainly be glad to address any specific questions.
Anyone from the commission have any specific questions for Brian? Commissioner Allenberg.
Yes, Brian, I reviewed the notes, the committee's notes, and I know this got asked, but I'm not so sure that I understood the answer. I guess is on the stricken lines there, particularly line 6, about has there ever historically been a resident wolf population? And I understand that maybe there was some in literature, but is there any scientific, is there any archaeological findings or anything that scientifically says that they were absolutely here?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Allenberg, there actually is well-documented evidence that wolves were in Nevada. What's not really clear is the extent to which they were here. We don't have any clear evidence that there was ever that they were ever numerous. They occurred here. We recognize that they, you know, we had our most recent documented confirmed sighting in November of last year. I believe, going from memory, it was 1922 when we had the last confirmed sighting. And so they haven't been common. They aren't common. There probably have been additional forays of wolves into Nevada that we were not able to confirm. However, we don't think that this is a, you know, just looking at the prey base, probably not likely that there's going to be a lot of wolves within Nevada.
Further Commissioner Hubbs.
Yeah, I think Commissioner McNinch summed up a lot of the discussion. We did have a lot of discussion on this policy, and like he stated, we decided to bring it back to the full commission. Obviously we were going back and forth about the intent to have the verbiage in there for the wolf in general or not. And so I was wondering if having that verbiage or line item for the wolf was proper for this policy, in specifically as it's titled Protection of Nevada Wildlife Resources. It was a little bit irrelevant to the purpose of the policy, and I think we also wanted the full commission to think about that in general, because basically it's speaking about protection of resources and how the department, the state level works with the federal level. And then all of a sudden there's the wolf language, a lot of which has been deleted, but that one item was left in. And Chairman Wallace, you can explain perhaps the rationale behind that.
Thank you, Commissioner Hubbs. And true to that, I had concern for removing this entirely from this policy. And my thinking on it is I don't feel like as a commission policy, I don't see there's anything wrong with the commission having a policy of saying, we do not want a permanent resident population of wolves in Nevada. Not to say that they don't come here naturally, but in my perspective, I don't want to see, I want to have a policy that says we are not open to someone outside wanting to introduce them, reintroduce them, or whatever the proper terminology is, to Nevada. And that was my concern with completely removing this from the policy, because before we started making edits, it was a pretty large portion of this policy. And to just strike it out entirely without having it maybe in a different policy even for that matter, but that was my thought process on why I didn't want to have it completely stricken from this policy. And I don't, Commissioner Valentine, did you have anything to add to that, or?
Well, it was just, and I agree with everything you said, that was the same reasons that I wanted to remain in this policy, was the fact that I don't believe we ever had, and the possibility of having an outside organization reintroduce wolves into the state of Nevada when there wasn't actually, as far as I'm concerned, a viable wolf population in the state. I wanted that particular statement to remain in this policy.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Wakely.
Brian Wakeling, for the record. Just a couple of comments on this particular aspect of it. The department, you know, if the commission chooses to retain the position statement within the policy that advocates or actually opposes the position or opposes the introduction of wolves or the establishment of wolves within Nevada, the department had a recommendation that that we would remove, or would recommend that the department's position be removed from that, because this is a commission policy. But in addition to that, the whole intent of this policy is to obtain state authority for those species that we can, at the most, obtain state authority and state management authority for those species, because we believe that we have the opportunity to work with our local communities and the federal communities. We do a better job of being able to do that. We're not encumbered by a lot of the challenges that the federal agencies are. To that end, the department is working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service currently to develop a coordination plan that will allow us and delineate clear authority for wolves should another one actually extend into the Nevada again. That authority would include clear delineation on under what circumstances the department would even have lethal take authority. It's not a management plan. We don't believe we're anywhere close to a point at which we would need to develop a management plan. But the intent of the policy is largely to give the opportunity for the commission to provide guidance to the department on what aspects we wish to consider during those types of things. The goal, and it speaks to the public on the intent of having state authority and state management authority for the broadest suite of species that we can possibly maintain. And just offer those thoughts as the commission deliberates.
Thank you, Mr. Wakeling. Further, Commissioner Allenberg.
Yes, I would agree with Commissioner Chairman Wallace and Commissioner Valentine both. There's a huge difference between natural migration into our state and voluntary introduction of them. And having language in there that separates that would, you know, I think is relevant and important.
Further commission questions or comments before I take it to public comment? Seeing none, I'll take it. Thank you, Mr. Wakeling. I'll take it out to public comment on agenda item number 11, Commission Policy 27.
John Hyatt for the record. First note that it's difficult to write good legislation and maybe even more difficult to write good regulations to go with that. The first thing I would say is on point number 1 here. Actually, NRS 501.100 number 1 says, wildlife in this state not domesticated and in its natural habitat is part of the natural resources belonging to the people of the state of Nevada. I don't know what the definition of natural habitat is. I would argue potentially one could look at chukar and say that chukar are not in their natural habitat here, and therefore the state would not have authority to regulate chukar. That would be one argument that could be made. So we need to look at what we're talking about: native habitat, natural habitat, or suitable habitat, because there are differences in those 3 categories. So I know you don't write NRS, but that's something that the department needs to think about. In item number 6, the second sentence says, state management responsibility through collaboration among other states and the federal government generally provides local communities with greater voice while considering the biological implications for the species management. Local communities needs to be defined. Does that mean local communities like everybody in Nevada? Does it mean people in a particular small community of maybe 100 people? That's important because, for instance, take an endangered species like the Beatty toad. Does that mean the people in Beatty get to make a decision about this, or does it mean the people in the state of Nevada, including the department, make a decision? So we need to think about what the definition of local community actually means here. And when it comes to wolves, complicated subject. I'm not sure that there's any private group that has the authority to deal with wolves because they're covered for the most part under Endangered Species Act, and private individuals are really prohibited from doing things like introducing those animals. But I would also say that if wolves naturally recolonize here, that's the only predator in North America that can really deal with feral horses. And there might be some advantages to having wolves in certain areas in Nevada. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Further public comment?
Mr. Chairman, Don Mulderino, Nevada Wildlife Alliance. A couple of things. I'm glad we had this discussion on the wolf issue. I objected to the language previously at the committee, thinking that it sounded very arrogant and without any public support, just a personal preference on somebody's part. If the intent is to speak to reintroduction versus voluntary, or volunteer as the farmers call plants that show up, I'm in favor of that. I think that language should be cleaned up and reflected that. That differentiation as has previously been mentioned. With respect to Mr. Wakeling's comments about wolves, their previous presence in the state or lack thereof, I would point out to you that if you review the literature about the state's ungulate population 100, 150 years ago, and there's a very nice book regarding this at the Nevada Art Museum that I bought the department a copy the other day, but I forgot to bring it. Anyway, it turns out the only ungulates who were around in those days were pronghorns and bighorns. There was rarely a deer that could be seen, maybe not even an elk. So the same circumstances Mr. Wakeling described about wolves also is characteristic of ungulates. So it seems to me that we have ungulates by the thousands, and trying to claim wolves have no business being here when ungulates weren't here either, at least mule deer and elk, it seems somewhat self-serving. So I'm in favor of the wolf language being cleaned up. Voluntary appearance of wolves in this state should be just fine. They have as much a place here as far as I can see as do mule deer and elk, because they were all in the same situation 100 years ago. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Muldy.
Hello, for the record, Patrick Donnelly with the Center for Biological Diversity in Las Vegas. Appreciate the changes that are being made here and cleaning up some of the language, and also appreciate the department's proactive approach to this. Obviously, a wolf showed up a little while ago. It was actually the same week I started my job, so I thought that was a little omen. So a wolf showed up. The time has come to sort of address how that's going to look, and so I appreciate that proactive action. I think a better way to address the wolf issue would be in a separate commission policy, where it could be addressed outside the context of the intent of the rest of this policy. And more broadly, I mean, a separate policy and/or a management plan. I think other states like Washington and Oregon did proactive management plans before the wolves showed up. They decided how they were going to deal with that. You know, just so it's not on the radar, you know, my organization is the ones who go around advocating for reintroductions. We are not going to advocate for reintroductions in Nevada. Nevada was historically wolf habitat. I think everyone, or many people, acknowledge that, but there weren't wolves running around Big Smoky Valley or Las Vegas Valley. You know, we're talking about small, likely small populations in isolated pockets. So another approach would be to change the language in this to reflect the sentiment that I heard expressed, that, yeah, natural migration may happen. Your opposition is to active reintroductions. That could be a different way of approaching this policy. Because I think also in terms of reflecting the will of the people of Nevada, wolves poll very well in the general populace in America. People like wolves. Not everybody, obviously. Folks who run cattle tend not to like wolves. But a lot of folks are in support of wolves. And I think if there were a public engagement process that many people in the state of Nevada would support the natural migration of wolves into the state. In conclusion, you know, my organization would support the natural migrations of wolves into the state, and, you know, potentially the establishment of resident populations if that's what the wolves chose to do. But I think that would be best addressed in a separate and public process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Further public comment? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission. Further questions or comments from the commission? Commissioner Hubbs?
I was the one that felt too at our committee meeting that perhaps a second policy would be better, and maybe, you know, adding some of the verbiage that Mr. Wakeling brought up in terms of the overall goals for the state to interact with that species along with the federal government, you know, who has what type of, you know, take authority, if you will, once the wolf, if it does hit the state, at least there would be clear boundaries defined as to how the state of Nevada would handle that. And then we could avoid any issues with the listed species and not working properly with the federal government. But if the commission doesn't have a flavor to do a new policy, I think I'm also in agreement with cleaning up the language and specifically calling out reintroduction, as if we take a stance where we don't want the wolf reintroduced into Nevada, that's one thing, but if they just voluntarily appear, that's completely different, I think.
Thank you, Commissioner Hubbs. Further commission comments? Commissioner Barnes?
Yeah, I'm kind of agreement that we need to have something on wolves, and the fact that I don't think there is any other policy that this commission has on it. I think, you know, it's a fairly complex issue. We probably should have its own policy, but because there isn't a policy, I think we need to leave it in there so it's on the books as to what the policy is. And I guess as far as I'm concerned, whether they come in naturally or they're reintroduced, it's still the end result to what they could do to our wildlife populations, and as well as domestic livestock. I mean, the end result's going to be the same. So I think I kind of like the statement as it's written that, what does it say, we oppose a permanent population of wolves in Nevada. I like that statement. I think that for now we need to leave it as is, unless we draft its own policy. But I think it's something that we need to have as a policy for this commission.
Thank you, Commissioner Barnes. I just wanted to ask the commission what Mr. Wakeling brought up, that maybe if we remove the part of the Department of Wildlife and just leave it as a commission policy, what does the commission think of that? Commissioner Alberg?
I would be good with that.
Commissioner McNinch?
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, there's going to be times where, you know, we're setting policy. It's a fine line, but yeah, I'm totally fine with it. And I do agree. You know, if they're coming in naturally, they're playing a role of some kind. We may not fully understand it, but I think that there's ways to manage it. I don't think it's going to get out of hand, and if it does, I don't think it's going to happen so fast that we can't manage it. So I do like the concept of whether it's in this policy or another one, the concept of splitting the hair between active reintroductions versus just the natural occurrence of them, you know, as they come and go, whatever extent that might be. And if we're going to do another policy, I don't have a problem with leaving this one in until that policy's in and approved and we're good to go, and then we can consider removing this as part of the whole process. That's just kind of where I'm at with it.
Further Commissioner Hubbs?
If we go down that road, it's just, to me, it's the manner in which this is written. It's saying that the commission and the department, they just, in general, oppose a permanent population of wolves in Nevada. And if it's a naturally occurring or natural migration in, it's like, why would we target one species and just oppose that population? It just sounds a little bit odd. It's part of the wildlife. It's something that we need to actually take care of and manage and hold in trust. If it's here naturally and it's naturally occurring, I don't know why all of a sudden we would target one and say, we just oppose wolves. I find that kind of an odd blanket statement for the state to take. If they're here naturally, they're held in trust by us, and we shouldn't just inadvertently oppose one species population, period. It just seems odd to me. For that reason, I would not, I mean, I'm hoping we might clean it up at least because it sounds odd to me.
Further commission comments? Commissioner Johnston?
I think the deletion of "and the Department of Wildlife" from paragraph 9 is appropriate. It's the commission's policy. I was just pulling up NRS 501-181 about the commission shall establish policies for, and it lists a number of items that this fits under, and one of those things is to also guide the department. So it's really the commission's policy. I don't know what permanent population means. Seems to me if the policy of the commission is to oppose a population of wolves, we should delete the term permanent. And I think that people voicing opposition to this policy as it's written now is a roundabout way of getting this commission on board with actually supporting wolves in Nevada without saying it. And basically urging us to adopt a policy that if they migrate here, that somehow that's okay, and our policy supports that. And I'm not so certain we can say it's a natural migration of wolves if they're migrating from areas where they've been reintroduced. Is it really a natural migration then? We're far beyond that kind of understanding, I think. So I'm fine with the policy as drafted. My preference would be to delete the word permanent, and just have it read as the policy of the commission to oppose a population of wolves in Nevada.
Commissioner McNinch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know how long ago it's been. I know Director Wasley will know what I'm referring to, but there was a study done, and there was an occurrence, a reduction in neotropical migrants in Yellowstone. This is 20 years ago, Tony, probably more than that. And the question was, what's driving that reduction? So neotropical migrants are your warblers, you know, the birds that migrate and come for the spring and summer, and then they head back to warmer, more temperate climates in the winter. And these birds they plummeted. And the the question was why? What's occurred? And there was a pretty notable staffer from the University of Nevada, Reno, Joel Berger. He's done a lot of work with wildlife species and conservation biology, that kind of stuff. And he was involved with a study up there, and it was determined that the reason for the reduction in neotropical migrant nesting in Yellowstone was a result of the saplings, the aspen and the trees being eaten down by elk. So here you have this situation where an expanded elk population had an impact on these neotropical migrants. So the question was, why? How does that happen? And what it boiled down to is that we had this top-level predator removed from the ecosystem up there at the time, and it was a loss of wolves, which allowed the elk to expand, which impacted. So it's an ecosystem issue, is what I'm trying to say. And I do believe that if we get if we do get wolves moving into an area in Nevada, for whatever reason, there's something driving it, and it's a real sensitive system. As tough as it is and as natural as it is, I think that if we get a natural migration of wolves into the area, it's going to be for a reason. Maybe they're getting pushed out by something, but maybe we're getting to a point where that balance. Maybe we have too many elk. I don't know. Maybe there's an imbalance that's occurred, something that's brought them in, and I look at it as part of the balancing system. I don't think we're ever going to have so many that we have to worry about it. So I would really like to see us, talk about that reintroduction versus the volunteer or the natural movement of the animals. And if it ever gets to a spot where it gets out of hand and we're having impacts to the ranching community or to that, then we have a different conversation. And we can have management plans and work pursuant to the rest of the policy, work with our federal partners and find out what's going on there. So that's where I'm at. I mean, if we had to move in now, how are we going to handle it?
Thank you, Commissioner McNinch. Further comments from the commission? Commissioner Hubbs?
I agree with Commissioner McNinch because I think the reintroduction is what's making individuals nervous, especially individuals with resources, that could be injured by the wolves. But even in the historical data, they were talking about Vernon Bailey's journals. They were hardly documented, but they were here. It was probably more or less what we're seeing is some type of dispersal pattern where you're getting some, a long-distance migrator into the area and then moves out. I think we may be getting a little bit too defensive before we really need to be. I think it reads odd if we just are against a population of species. I think it sounds odd. That's my personal opinion. But I would be okay with saying we're against the reintroduction of a certain population if we don't feel that that's beneficial to the state. But just a wolf coming into the area, I don't know why we would take such a hard stance.
Thank you, Commissioner Hubbs. Commissioner Barnes?
Yeah, I think, I guess I'm not gonna change. I think I'm gonna still be opposed to any population. I mean, if one or two come in, they're gonna come in. But I think we need to, for now, I think we need to leave something for a commission policy. And so with that, I'm gonna attempt a motion. So I'm going to move to approve policy 27 as presented with the following changes. In line 9, strike "and the Department of Wildlife" and the word "permanent."
I have a motion and a second, but the issue I think we have is this is just going to be advanced to a second reading is what it would be. So I feel like we need to have the motion to say that it would be advanced to a second reading at the November commission meeting for approval.
Okay, that's fine.
Is that okay? Is the second clear with that?
However you want to change it.
I do have one comment though before call the question. And I think it's important to note what the existing policy of the commission is now, which is what we see with the black letters and the red strike through. So the current policy of the commission is the policy of the commission and the Department of Wildlife to oppose a permanent population of wolves in Nevada. And then there was added language in the policy, and since in 1974 the gray wolf was listed, and it goes on. So this isn't any new policy. It's a continuation of the existing policy to be updated and taking out some information that's not needed. So I don't feel a need to go any further in changing the policy than what's presented in the draft.
Okay, is everyone clear with the motion? I'm going to restate it just to make sure. The motion was to approve the changes to policy 27 as presented by the department with the following changes on number 9. 9, correct? 9, to remove the Department of Wildlife and remove permanent, to leave the sentence that says, it is the policy of the commission to oppose a population of wolves in Nevada, and that this would be moved to a second reading for the November meeting. Motion maker and second clear with that? Is that the intent of your?
It is from the second.
Yeah.
Okay.
Make her the motion.
Just want to be clear, and everyone else is clear? Okay, I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Motion passes, is that 5-2 with Commissioner McNinch and Hubbs opposed. And just to be clear on that, the motion was made by Commissioner Barnes with a second by Commissioner Johnston. So we'll close agenda item number 11, move to agenda item number 12. Commission Policy 65, Designation of Wildlife Management Areas, first reading. Commissioner and APRP Committee Chairman David McNinch for possible action. The commission will conduct a first reading of Commission Policy 65 and may take action to revise the policy. The commission may advance the policy to a second reading for possible adoption at a future meeting. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if you've had a chance to glance at it, it's been a very long time since this policy was even reviewed. Milan Brown was the chairman at the time, and that's going back, we're talking decades now. So anyway, the committee did move to approve the amendments to the policy as they were presented to the committee, which you're seeing those the proposed changes right there. And what it boils down to is the things that are being proposed for deletion are the reason why they're being taken out is that they're either now nature centers or state parks. They're no longer wildlife management areas. And with respect to Railroad Valley Wildlife Management Area listed under the southern region, it's actually owned and managed by the BLM. So it's really just edits and cleanup language from a very old policy that's kind of stood the test of time. So,
Questions from the commission? Seeing none, I'll take it out to public comment on Commission Policy number 65, agenda item number 12. Seeing no public comment, I'll bring it back to the commission for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd move policy 65 as presented to a second reading at the November commission meeting.
second.
I have a motion by Vice Chairman Johnston and a second by Commissioner McNinch to move Commission Policy 65 as presented by the department for another reading in November. Questions on the motion? Call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously, 7-0. Close agenda item number 12, move to agenda item number 13. Commission Policy 66, Management and Use of Wildlife Management Areas, first reading, Commissioner and APRP Committee Chairman David McNinch for possible action. The commission will conduct a first reading of Commission Policy 66 and may take action to revise the policy. The commission may advance the policy to a second reading for possible adoption at a future meeting. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So policy 66, Again, the committee was presented with some proposed edits and language updates to the management and use of wildlife management areas. So some pretty basic stuff just to update it, and again, a couple of editorial changes. And you're largely seeing you're seeing what was approved by the committee. So we recommend move it forward to a second reading as is.
Questions from the commission? Seeing none, I'll take it out for public comment on agenda item number 13, Commission Policy number 66. Seeing no public comment, I'll bring it back to the commission.
This is moving a little bit faster than I had a comment. I understood, there's the deletion of therefore it is the intent of the board that the department develop strategies to implement programs and an attempt to assess the non-consumptive users. Do we then need that funding sources paragraph in this policy? I mean, it seemed that paragraph was really kind of directed at the part that the committee is recommending we omit.
Commissioner Johnson, help me, and I just caught up to where you were reading.
Okay, if I'm
I'm
looking at policy 66.
Yeah, I'm on the back page. I'm there finally. So
yeah, on the last page, and the committee is making the recommendation to strike the language. Therefore, it is the intent of the board, which is basically to guide the department to assess a fee to non-consumptive users. And with that being struck, I mean, it just seems like the first couple sentences then really don't have a place in the policy any longer. Because as I read that funding source, it was talking about how the ownership and maintenance and management of property and water is expensive, and how the current WMA system provides both direct and indirect benefits to the general public. And then it's like, however, it is the consumptive users that are currently paying a majority of these costs, therefore it is the intent of the board. And it just seems if you're going to strike the last sentence, it to just strike the entire section regarding funding sources.
yeah, I understand what you're saying, and it does make a lot of sense. I mean, we're basically talking one side of the equation here if we take it out.
Commissioner Hubbs.
I thought when I first read over that, it's funny that Vice Chair Johnson brought that up, but just because I know you're a consumptive user, it sounds a little bit like somehow somebody gets more priority because they fund something, and it's a little bit, it may be off-putting to I'm just thinking the people that aren't consumptive, I mean, they can go out to use these areas, no? Or they just, their status, I mean, it can almost sound like somehow they're second-class citizens, if you will, just because they're identified as non-consumptive.
I guess my point is there's no policy statement when you take out the last sentence. So either you modify this to say it's the policy of the commission to let the consumptive users continue to facilitate the funding and not assess non-consumptive users, because that would then be the policy, or you just take out the funding sources language altogether. Because in my mind, once you omit the last sentence of this section, there's no policy statement in that final section.
Commissioner Hubbs.
Yeah, I would be fine removing the entire paragraph funding sources if it's pointless at this point.
I'm trying to go back to the meeting and remember the discussion on this.
It's kind of foggy for me too, but I remember feeling the same way, like why are we, and then, actually got into several I just think a sidebar about why are the non-consumptive individuals not paying to utilize, or for the area, and thinking if maybe non-consumptive users would want to contribute. I don't know, but to say one has priority over the other, not giving one the opportunity to fund and the other one funding, and saying because that one funds they have higher priority, just sounds odd. I was thinking of how many birders I know that would pay to go, keep a ground pristine, nice for birding, something that's non-consumptive in general.
Well, in thinking back on it and trying to remember the discussion, I feel like the discussion was kind of along the line. I don't think it was necessarily singling out and saying that you're a second-class citizen, but it was more reiterating where the funding's coming from for these management areas. And, so maybe we need to word it a little bit differently, but I'd have to go back and look at the tape, listen to the tapes and hear the discussion on that, but that was a couple months ago. Commissioner McNinch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I believe that there is language in here that kind of, that does kind of reiterate the concept that, it's not cheap to maintain a wildlife management area, and that a lot of the money that goes into them are coming from sportsmen and funds that are brought in by the sportsman dollar. And I do believe that wildlife management areas, I think that, is it in statute or administrative code, that it does give priority to the sportsmen, because that's what they're there for. I don't know, Tony, help me out with that, or I don't know if somebody can or not, but and if I can make one more quick comment before there was an attempt, it's been several years now, 10, 15 years ago, to establish a system for payment by non-consumptives. And the proposal basically said if you hold a hunting or fishing license, then you can access these wildlife management areas on that license. You've already paid your entry fee, but if you're a non-consumptive, then you have to pay a fee to get into them to kind of offset that. And it did not get through the commission to go to as a bill draft to the legislature. So there was an attempt to do that, and that was probably very close to the same time frame that this policy was developed. So we can always look into that again if we wanted to. So,
Director Wasley?
Thank you, Chairman Wallace. I guess what I'd do is point to what Commissioner McNitch brought up initially, and that's the age of this policy. And I think this language is an artifact of that era. I think that there's been funding opportunities through Q1, Q5, PR, DJ that have allowed us to have more inclusive funding for these. And I think if there is a desire to change the language, my recommendation would be to try to steer clear of the divisive consumptive versus non-consumptive and just use language affirming the benefits of broader funding, more inclusive funding, and an encouragement to the department to explore broad and diverse funding opportunities for the benefits of all citizens, which would be consistent with our statutory charges.
So now you need to say what he said. Vice Chairman Johnson.
Yeah, following on that, then I think it really gets us to a good spot of keeping the funding sources and the first two sentences as written. Delete the last two sentences. So that would read, the ownership, maintenance, and management of real property, particularly land and water, is an expensive program component of Fish and Wildlife Management. The current WMA system provides both direct and indirect benefits to the general public through habitat and migratory bird protection. It is the intent of this commission that the department develop broad strategies and programs to fund the wildlife management areas from as broad a sources as possible. I don't know if that's too loosey-goosey, but something to that effect. What I think would clean up this kind of flip-flop, us versus them. It is an expensive endeavor to manage these, and let's fund them from the means that we can, and not make reference to consumptive versus non-consumptive uses.
Was that a motion?
If it was clear enough to be a motion, so I can maybe I'll rephrase it.
Commissioner McNinch.
So with the conversation, I do appreciate the conversation, by the way. There are two headings on page 3 that are specific to consumptive and non-consumptive. When you brought this up, Commissioner Johnson, the funding source thing stood out to me a lot more clearly and obvious today than it did before. I don't know why it didn't stand out to me before, but so there are some discussions on the consumptive and non-consumptive. I'm wondering if it might be more productive to just bring this back, cycle back through the committee with a look at that aspect of it too, to see if, if we need to adjust some language in there as well, based on the conversation and where we're heading here. I'm just throwing that out.
Further commission comments on maybe Commissioner McNinch's idea there, sending it back through the policy committee? Since we have no other policies to look at.
I think that's it. The second read, as long as we can provide direction to, I think Mr. Janae is writing this, and is he here today?
No.
I didn't see him. I don't see him. But he would be able to maybe rework these areas and provide a second iteration for us to review again.
Commissioner Johnson, any comments? Okay. Then maybe we should just bring it back to, maybe if we can bring it through the policy committee and have Mr. Janae present when we're, at that point, it might be easier to have a better discussion on it, and he wouldn't have to go back and try and review our tapes and figure out what our intentions were, and because I don't think this is a super pressing policy that we need to kick some other ones back, but maybe Jordan can put it into the priority list.
Not since 2002.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it needs to be looked at, but I mean, maybe for the January, February meeting, that time period potentially.
yeah. It actually doesn't read horribly bad based on the way that the laws are, I think, because I think it reflects what the laws say about wildlife management areas, having, hunters and anglers take some precedent. I think it states that somewhere, not just in this policy, so, but anyway, okay. We can certainly take it back and go through it again.
So we can either go to the committee with it, or if I have a motion from a commissioner, we would consider, but at this point, if I'm not seeing one, I think we'll take it back to the policy committee. Commissioner Johnston?
I would like to see it go back to the committee. I mean, I was catching the changed language and identified that issue, and now you read the entire policy, and there might be some additional cleanup that's needed, and maybe not. Let's get it right, and that's probably the best way to get it right, is to have it go back to the committee.
That sounds good. Further comments on this agenda item before we close it? Okay, seeing none, we'll close agenda item number 13. What's the flavor of the commission? Do we want to break, or we want to keep on?
How long is Tony going to be?
All right, we'll take a 10-minute break till 2:40.